This episode of the Vincast, like so many before it, is proudly supported in part by Different Drop. Different Drop is one of the most exciting wine retailers in this country, specializing in Australian wines, but not just any old Australian wines. We're talking some really small batch, artisan, family owned wines, often made in very exciting styles using different grape varieties from any region you can imagine in Australia. Different Drop have a really fantastic website where they sell from. They're based in Sydney, but they can ship wines all over the country very easily and very inexpensively. And when you go to the website, you can find a whole host of different wines. It's very easy to search for any kind of wine style you might be interested in, or any wine producer, including many former guests of this podcast. So a great way of supporting the podcast and the guests who generously donate their time is by going to differentdrop.com/intrepidwino, where you'll find all the wines that they have available from previous guests of the podcast. And make sure that when you any wine you do purchase on a Different Drop website, when you go through to the paywall, make sure to put in the special coupon code IntrepidWino, and the guys at Different Drop will give you a 10% discount, which is a fantastic way to support them for supporting the former guests of the podcast who support the podcast. On episode 84 of the Vincast, I chat with Walter Speller, one of the foremost authorities on Italian wine, writing for JancesRobinson.com. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome back to another episode of the Vincast with myself, James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And right off the bat, you might be able to pick up a little bit of a funny sound in my voice. I'm fighting off a cold, so I think certainly the next couple of episodes you'll certainly hear slightly fluey, coldy kind of sound to my voice, so apologies in advance. I was actually at the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival Aquapana wine events this past weekend, where I was able to, I was helping out, I was pouring and listening into some fascinating chats about wines from all over the world, which was really a fantastic opportunity. And it also gave me an opportunity to meet with a number of different wine people who I actually was able to record a few episodes with. So you will hear in the next couple of weeks people that I was able to record with whilst they were here in Australia, including my guest for this week, Walter Speller. He is originally from the Netherlands, worked for many years in Berlin and ended up in London, where he met Jancis Robinson and was invited to start writing for her website, and is considered to be one of the foremost authorities on Italian wine and authentic Italian wine at that. And I was really, really fascinated. I sat in on his tasting over the weekend and looked at some wines that I'd never even seen before, a couple that I had. And so it was really great to chat with him and hear about his background. He's an amazing person, and definitely I hope you enjoy this episode. Please have a listen to the end of the episode so you can find out how you can get in contact with Walter to thank him for being on the podcast. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. I would also just like to point out that during our recording, we were unfortunately asked to vacate the room that we were recording in, so we actually popped outside to continue the recording. So you will hear a little bit of difference about halfway through the podcast. Walter, thank you very much for making a bit of time whilst you are here in Australia, and at the end of a very wonderful weekend as part of Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, and after your fantastic tasting. So thank you for being on the Vincast.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Walter, I typically start every episode of my podcast by asking my guest if they can remember the first interaction they had with wine that made them think about it in a different way and think that maybe they'd like to pursue a career in wine.
Yeah, that was for me Passarina de Frusinate. So I read about these things now, about people, their first key wine moment. And Jancis is very particular because she's always talking about a certain Burgundy from 1952. If I
just casually,
as her defining moment that I get. But Passarina de Frusinate from a Cantina Sociale that I had in Berlin as my eye-opening moment. The wine was absolutely nothing special. But the name, what it evoked for me, the imagery, the fact that something existed in the area near Rome that carried this lofty name, and that got me hooked. The wine was nothing special, but it just draw in so many things.
Where are you from originally?
I'm originally Dutch.
Okay.
Yes.
Did your family or did your parents drink wine at all? Was wine in...
No, I'm in Holland at that time when I was young. Drinking even water at dinner was considered to be unhealthy. So we never drank anything at the dinner table. Only when I moved to Berlin when I was 21 on a scholarship, Erasmus it was called, was very popular. Everybody wanted to go to London and Florence, and I decided to go to Berlin basically because it was the only place left. That was one of the most... I had to get out of Holland because it was so stifling, and so people always think it's such a free and democratic country and very liberal. It is, but in a way it's very stifling.
There's still a sort of a conservative edge to it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the 1980s were not that inspirational. So I got this scholarship, and I think it was two times I was at the University of the Universität, the Freie Universität in Berlin, 2 times, and then I just started to live in Berlin. It was a great time. It was
this
there
pre-fall of the Berlin
Wall?
Wall?
No, just immediately afterwards in 1991.
Wow, that would have been incredible.
And so you couldn't go to university. You didn't have time for it. There was a whole new world to explore.
Yeah.
And so this is how I got into contact with wine. Basically, I met my partner, and he loved to cook and he loved wine, and I was not even, remotely interested in wine. When I was a student, I drank Beaujolais and Four Roses whiskey. But that triggered something.
I wonder what the common theme with those two products is. Not expensive?
Well, yeah, I suppose so. Good student party fodder. Yeah. I've grown out of that, I'd say. But basically, it was the connection to food, Italian food, and then I got pretty quickly on the wine trail. But even there in Berlin, and that's not it is a fascinating city. It will always remain my spiritual home. But it's not, the wine scene is very, very small, of course.
Yeah.
And it was all about German Riesling, which I learned to appreciate there because
that's really interesting.
Everything available, and dry Rieslings that I later on, as a wine buyer, tried to introduce into London, and they were still on this medium dry Mosel wines, and I was frustrated by that because I really wanted to see dry, steely stuff. And I was also tasting for the International Wine Challenge at that time, and when I was speaking to the buyers who were on my team, the people who had years of experience, would say dry Riesling, no balance. And then they were very hard to get anyway, the dry Riesling from Germany, but there was dry Riesling from Australia.
Plenty of Blue Nun, I'm sure.
And Blue Nun, but I was working for Convent, so Blue Nun was not on the list. And so I had these, all of a sudden there were these dry Rieslings from Australia, and I bought those. And they were an instant hit. In the restaurant. And also the French sommeliers liked them very much because they had this petrolly note. Now we would say, it was too hot, but anyway, doesn't matter. These Australian Rieslings opened the door to German dry Riesling, and on the back of that, we bought them.
Do you think there was any particular reason they might have been a little bit against the idea of German Riesling? Was there still kind of a feeling about,
the Germans themselves did everything they could to produce the worst they could think of. On a generic level, the Blue Nun and Bent in the River and what they were called. Not if you taste them nowadays, they're actually absolutely not bad, and not as bad as people always think. But they don't have any Riesling in them. So, but Germany became, of course, identified with that type of wine. whereas there's much more happening. Italy has the same problem more or less, because when talking about Italy, especially in the UK market, it's Prosecco and Pinot Grigio, which stands for Italy. To talk up to those two brands is very, very difficult. Firstly, because Pinot Grigio is the best-selling white in the UK.
And the US.
The best-selling white, period. And Prosecco, who makes bigger and bigger inroads worldwide. That's a problem. But I always say that
Pinot Grigio and Prosecco for me is kind of like the Matus of our generation, or the current generation.
Well, I think that basically those wines speak to a different audience than I speak to, or that we speak to.
Yeah.
Without wanting to sound snooty, I really don't have any problem. Really, if people enjoy Pinot Grigio or enjoy Prosecco, I think they miss out on a lot of things, but it's not up to me for them to steer them in that direction.
At least they're drinking wine.
Yeah, exactly. At a certain price point, when people are willing to fork out more for wine, then you talk about anything else but Prosecco and Pinot Grigio. For me, there's two types of consumers, or one that wants to have a basic solid drink that they like, and there's the wine lover who is more intrigued by what wine stands for, the whole idea behind it, the story, the complexity. And so I don't see them as the same audience.
Yeah,
I don't feel threatened by Pinot Grigio or by Prosecco. I'm not lamenting the fact that they take market shares away. That's not true for me.
So what was your first job in wine?
My first job in wine was when I had just written my PhD, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, practically learning by heart the Hugh Johnson pocket guide, wine guide, because I didn't know really what to do. And at some stage, I heard from friends, I was working in bars at that stage, that there was an Italian restaurant to be opened in the new center of Berlin, in Mitte, which was the former East Berlin, which was owned and financed by one of the biggest club promoters in Berlin, and that was the years of the techno scene, Tresor. And he had a partner, an Italian, who became my boss, Rudy Girolo. And he was looking for people, and it was very hard to find somebody who was really interested in wine, and Italian wine, and wouldn't cost a mint. And so they recruited me. And at the beginning, I was quite offended because Rudy, my boss, with whom I'm still friends, and we still see each other regularly, he wanted me to wait tables, and I was thinking I was going to play this glorious role as sommelier, and he said, no, that's not how we do things here. You need to be able to do everything. So you need to also be able to take the order, to serve food, and to sell wine. So he basically taught me.
I'll let you write the list, but you still have to do all of the work.
No, that was not the case at all. He would write a list, but what was interesting was that he bought all the wines directly from Italy.
Wow.
And so at some stage we started to work more closely together, and we would then select wines together, and he had loads of contacts. The thing was that we built up a whole list of wines that were not known in Germany, because we did not have Sassicaia, we did not have Tignanello, we did not have Gaia. Sure, basically because we could never... the restaurant needed to make a profit. And so we had to cut out the middleman, the importer. And so basically we were forced in that direction, but it was a much more interesting way to discover new things. And what you discover then consequently have to sell. Will it sell? Will people find your wines good enough? And they did. So it was a whole list of wines that nobody knew, and we sold tons of it. Just because we were behind it. We had this enthusiasm, we had discovered those wines. We bought them and we sold them, say, the next evening at the table. It was a brilliant time.
Was there a certain style of wine, or were there particular regions that people were...
Oh, no, it was basically... At those days, you needed to have at least 3 or 4 wines of every region, and that was the... That was the lead of the wine list. So, and it could depend. We were also very price point driven, so we needed to find really good value for money. So we were more, let's say, left field, or we're more, venturing outside of the really big names. So we had very little Brunello and very little Barolo, for that we would find other things at a much better quality. Much better price point, and an interesting quality, a good quality. But you have to sell it. That learned me how to explain things quickly to customers at the table without wasting too much of the time, and convinced by the quality in the glass. it was very, very, very formative those years. Yeah.
And was this sort of when you started to get a little bit of a love affair with Italy and with Italian
I've
wines?
always been in love with it because every holiday, and when I was living in Berlin, there were quite a lot of holidays because those were the years where, money fell from trees. So every spare time was always spent in Italy. So from north to south, we were always there. That was always we went to France, always nice, beautiful. We have friends in Montpellier, but Italy was and still is magical.
Is there anything in particular that you like about, traveling in Italy? What is it about the hospitality that appeals to you more?
I think it's basically the enormous variation in landscape and from north to south. There's an enormous diversity in one country, also from climate point of view, and the variety, be it food, landscape, or wine, is impressive. It's immense. You can never get tired of it, and you can never get to know it in one life. That's the fascination.
Was there a particular region that you attached to quite early on that was your favorite?
The South. Certainly the South. For me, that represented the real, quote unquote, the real Italy. I'm not sure whether you can live there because you need to be very patient. And I'm a very impatient person, so that's probably not for me. But the South had this enormous warmth, not only from temperature, but it's all encompassing. Love the food, dramatic landscapes. The wines are not always that up to scratch. There's an enormous potential, and I still see it, and it's coming more and more out. But it was not necessarily the wine quality. It was more the whole drama of the South.
I find that there's more honesty in the wines of the South than possibly in the North.
Well, I'll ask you a question. Why do you think that?
Well, one thing that I like about the Southern Italians is there's a sort of more of an openness, and there's no kind of secrets. There's no kind of, we don't talk about that sort of thing. They're quite happy to discuss, what they do, and they also kind of want to ask, well, what do you think? What do you think we should do? That kind of thing. And I kind of think that that's reflected a little bit more in the wine than in the North, where, I don't know, they kind of keep it fairly simple, and there's like from my perspective, they don't clean the wines up as much as the wines of the North, for example. They're not
You're talking about honest rusticity, perhaps.
Yeah, to a certain extent.
Okay. I find that charming, and I see what you mean. But there are 2 points here, and
but also, I think the honesty comes through in the wines of being a little bit more simple and approachable, and to be consumed young.
Sure. I see your point. But like I said, there are two things. The first thing is that without wanting to sound arrogant, although I think I've lost that game anyway, is firstly because I am living a large part of my time in Italy. The more you are there, the more you can. But people will tell you everything you want to know. It depends on how you use that information. If it is constructive, I would talk about that. If it's not constructive to talk about, because then the next time people will not open up about what they're doing, what they're thinking, what's happening, then I would not use that. I'm not talking about self-censorship. It's about a certain discretion. Now, compared to France, for example, in France there are never any scandals, which I don't believe. Because every wine producing country has things to, broom under the carpet or under the table. But they're just way more discreet. Italians they are very much open by nature. So they tell you everything in good faith. Sometimes you need to just, guard them against them. So that's point one. The second thing is that rusticity is not for me necessarily the same as genuinity. You can be quite charmed about the simpleness and openness of certain wines from the South, but they cannot play on a certain top level where I think those wines should be. Now, I don't think that everybody should aim to be, a top producer. and just making good, simple wine that everybody enjoys is already quite a feat to accomplish. But I do think that if you want to really talk about the potential, for example, Aglianico, we want to talk about the potential of Nerella Mascalese, or also for Ciro, in the south of Puglia, then you need to have pretty good wine on that level. And I think that it's, for me, very important. So as much as I understand genuinity and rusticity and all that, I don't want Italy to be too much seen as that. I was speaking to Gaia when I was tasting the wines 2 weeks ago at Santa Restituta, and she said something where I thought, I never thought about that. She said, well, this is our Brunello from this vineyard. There's a certain rusticity to it, but that's Sangiovese. And although I saw what she meant, I didn't believe that. That's not how I see Sangiovese. Sangiovese can be like that, but the top is not necessarily rustic. The top can be really refined, like, for example, we saw today in this tasting with the Il Maronetto Madonna delle Grazie, 2005. So.
Do you think that rusticity is often used as an excuse, like to say, oh, but that's the charm of the wine, that that's just an expression of us and this place?
Then we first need to find out what we mean by rusticity. So whether we talk about the same thing. Tannins and acidity for me is not rustic.
No.
I think more about a certain, let's say, the Italians would call it contadino style, farmers wines, which has now become an honor, a banner of honor for many natural wines in Italy.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for natural wines in Italy because they have really brought a new dynamic in the whole wine game in Italy, and have brought in lots of new ideas based on evaluation of tradition, which I think is fascinating and was very, very necessary. So thank God for that. But it's not the only thing that I find important. So rusticity, to be permissive, to say, well, it's rustic, but it's genuine. You're being permissive, and I'm more demanding than that.
Mm. So how long did you work in Berlin for?
I spent there 13 years, and they really had to drag me screaming and crying away to go to London. I mean, it was a mutual decision because I wanted to move on with wine, and in Berlin you could not really move on. And I was already traveling so many times to London, 5-6 times a year, either to join for wine shows or to do courses or anything. So I knew I had to go there. And it took me 2 or 3 years to get used to London, but it was a fantastic springboard to anything else you want to do about wine. London is in Europe, the city to see this enormous diversity, to learn about the business, the amount of tastings that you can go to every day when you're in the trade. It's just mind-boggling.
So was there anything in particular that brought you to London apart from the fact that it was just a bigger market?
The knowledge, the availability of knowledge. In Berlin, I couldn't find any teachers. There weren't any courses, and certainly not on Italian wine. Whereas in London, there was so much what you can learn. There was the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, which is still there. There's the Institute of Masters of Wine. There are many tastings organized by generic bodies, wines of Spain, wine of South Africa, wines of Australia. Unfortunately, there is no generic body for Italy, but you get the picture. So there's an enormous availability of knowledge and information, so you can very quickly get a high level of sophisticated knowledge about wine in general. That's the great attraction of London.
Was there someone at that time who was considered to be, that's the reference point as far as a communicator or wine educator? That's the reference point for Italian wine. Was there such a person?
It was not at that time. Well, yeah, it was Burton Anderson from America, and for me, if you can say something like that because it sounds a bit hysterical. The guru for me is Nicholas Belfridge, because he managed in his books to write about Italy in a very critical and at the same time extremely evocative way. You just knew this man was deeply in love with that country and highly critical. And I just hope that I have a tiny bit of that capacity that he has when I'm writing about Italian wine.
What were you first doing when you moved to London as far as work?
I started to work as a sommelier for the Conran Group. I worked at La Pont de la Tour, which was a French restaurant because it was close to the city. It had an international list. I started, I think, in 2003, just after I did a vintage at Auberge Libérale in Bordeaux. And their customers were mostly city folks, and so high rollers, and so the list was very heavy on Bordeaux, very heavy on Burgundy, and lots of Australian wines, but the top. And there were also Italian wines, but there's more the stereotypical things like your Sassicaias, your Ornelayas, Tignanello, that featured very heavily. Brunellos that I would not consider to be of any special quality, except that they have well-known names and were very expensive. That was the Italian section. When I moved from being a sommelier to a wine buyer for Pont de la Tour, because it also had a wine merchant connected to it, I started to increase very, very rapidly the size of Italian wine to cover most regions. And there was quite a lot to be found in London. I had difficulty to get the French sommelier team behind me. As soon as the head sommelier became a German, or was a German girl, those wines were flying. The Burgundies were always very strong in that restaurant because we were known for that time. We had a list of 1,500 positions, which was huge at that time. I sold also quite a lot of Pinot Grigio, I admit. And we sold also quite a lot of plain, very simple French wines. But I always believe that would give you basically the basis to buy the more expensive, more interesting stuff that would not sell so quickly. So you win some, you lose some.
Mm. What was the general market for Italian wines like in London and the UK?
Misunderstood. I think misunderstood. Things like Chianti Classico were very difficult to sell because of the Chianti tag. There's, of course, a difference between Chianti and Chianti Classico, but that was what you saw in the supermarkets. And I tasted a lot of supermarket wines because I'm always quite curious, what is the general quality of those wines? And that didn't do Chianti Classico any good, although we have really fantastic Chianti Classico. Brunello and Amarone were brands, considered brands, so it didn't matter who was on that list. One would suffice as long as you had this Amarone or you had a Brunello, because that was basically, like I said, considered a brand. Soave, very, very difficult, unless wine by the glass, because then it was seen as a cheap option. And then the Super Tuscans, those were the expensive wines at the price level with not entirely, but going in the direction of Bordeaux's.
How do you think that the perception of Italian wine has evolved since then?
Well, I think it's much more diverse, but when I'm in the States, especially in New York, I find their level of knowledge far more sophisticated. And it's not so easily explained, except for the fact that there are perhaps more Italian immigrants in New York. So that's certainly a push factor. But there is no generic Italian body that promotes wines of Italy like there is wines of Australia, for example, and UK as a parallel. That doesn't exist. So knowledge is very difficult to build up, but the Americans have it much more than the Brits. I think perhaps it has to do with the fact that the Brits are a bit more at ease trading for more than 1,000 years in Bordeaux, for example. It's getting better because we're on the wave of indigenous grape varieties, and that's actually being delivered quite brilliantly by Italian wines.
Do you feel that you tend to kind of have more interest in particular style of wines, particularly in terms of Italy? Do you kind of lean more towards the traditional or low intervention? I don't like to use the other N word, I guess. It's a very dangerous discussion topic, would be here all night. But do you find that you do kind of gravitate more towards those kinds of wines?
I'm more interested in smaller producers, perhaps, who, of course, if you are a wine writer or a sommelier or I think for those groups, they are more interested in the, the less known, perhaps the more
esoteric.
Yeah, a little bit. There's a little bit of that, the unknown, and also because you can test out whether people appreciate your taste.
Sure.
And what makes you perhaps a signature vicar as a sommelier, as a wine buyer, as a wine writer. You're very much talking about your taste. You sell yourself nowadays.
If you talk about things that everyone talks about, you kind of go, well, why would I listen to you? You're saying whatever else is saying.
But there's, of course, this element of exploration and discovery, and then see it hopefully becoming a trend. I'm not driven by that. What I'm driven by is I'm looking for the genuine. That it often coincides with what you would name natural wines might be. Perhaps because, like I said today, the natural wines in Italy come from a different background than the French natural wines. It's more about incorporating or going back to tradition, reinvestigating what your grandfather did and not your father, who started to use stainless steel and barrique and planted Cabernet and Merlot, while your granddad was doing the indigenous grape varieties and using the old trellising systems. That kind of thing. So I'm driven by that discovery, that process, because I want to show and discover also for myself the genuine Italy. That doesn't necessarily mean the highest quality of wines, but certainly the most original.
I certainly hope you're enjoying this chat about a fantastic wine journalist. And speaking of wine journalism, I really want to tell you about Wine Companion, which is one of Australia's most important wine publications and references for wine, particularly wine made in Australia. Wine Companion originally started as James Halliday's way of cataloguing all of the tasting notes and reviews and scores he'd done for Australian wines, which are submitted to him every year, but evolved into a wine publication which comes out very regularly, and also an amazing website where you can actually buy a digital subscription. Wine Companion have partnered with the podcast to offer listeners of the podcast a fantastic discount on any of their subscription packages. Basically, if you go to the website winecompanion.com.au, when you go through to purchase any of their different subscription packages, if you put in the special code Intrepid30, they will give you a 30% discount. Huge savings, wonderful opportunity to read from a whole repository of articles and wine information. So I highly recommend going there and let them know that you heard about the discount from the podcast.
How did your career in the UK evolve? Like, at what point did you sort of start to get into talking about wine and maybe writing about wine and that kind of thing?
Well, when I was working as a wine buyer and no longer as a sommelier, I was having this fledgling wine merchant at Le Pont de la Tour, which didn't make any profit. And it didn't make any profit because not only because the wines were steeply priced, but it didn't have any instruments to actually sell the wine. We didn't have a website that worked. We couldn't do deliveries. Except for the barrow, and it was only local, and so we need to get punters in. And I set up the so-called speed master classes because I was confronted almost every day with 3 or 4 importers who would come with winemakers, and I didn't have time for that because we were very low on staff. And at the beginning I was annoyed, but then I thought I need to actually instrumentalize this enormous potential of winemakers that comes into London and get customers in. So I suggested to the importers, that's fine, bring them along, but why don't you let me have them for an hour in the evening? And so I did about 150, 160 of those master classes in the years that I was there. And it was big fun because it was only an hour. So it was, people came in droves. I had a little discount system attached to it. And you got an amazing amount of winemakers. And they came from everywhere. Australia was especially strong because they were really fun to put in front of the audience. That's where my long-lasting love affair with Australia came from. Very concise, very good in explaining things in a very simple way. great wines and entertaining, whereas, for example, I had Italian winemakers, she shall not be named, who would say my wines speak for themselves and would say nothing for a whole hour. That's really mortifying if you're running those things. But the Italians were particularly interesting because you could challenge really their thoughts. But we had winemakers from everywhere, from Germany, from Portugal, from California, everywhere, Argentina. I took everyone in because it was the beauty of having all these, this possibility of getting them in, speaking for an hour about the wine, present their wines, get feedback from the audience. The audience takes a couple of bottles away. So that's where I basically started to become vocal.
And that would have given you, of course, the opportunity to listen to, the winemakers from all these different parts of the world.
That was
and taste the
certainly
wines
interesting,
as
but
well.
most of the time I was actually interviewing them because a lot of them, except for the Aussies, were not able really to talk to an audience at all. So I really had to help them getting the story out. And
Did many of them require translation?
yeah, quite a bit. But that was fun too because that looked really genuine and very charming. And when they started in broken English, you already have the public at their knees.
Eating out of your hand.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And if the wine is good, then that's a fantastic hour. And it's only an hour, so people are really exciting, and it's a good format. After an hour, you lose everybody's patience and attention, including mine.
You might not need to say much, but you can say a little bit. That the wine can't just speak for itself. But even saying a little bit. Can
No,
make
I
a big
wanted
difference.
to hear their story.
Sure.
I wanted to, and also, it sounds really arrogant. They needed training. They needed to understand if they wanted to sell their wine. They needed to be able to, converse and tell the background and the story in very few words, and just make it speak for themselves. That's absolutely fine. Wine needs to speak for himself, but you're selling the story in the end. Somebody's got to tell that. The winemaker or the owner or the producer.
Mm-hmm.
He or she is the ideal person to do so.
So can you tell me how you what sort of path you followed to end up where you are now as far as writing for, amongst other places, for Jancis Robinson?
Well, Jancis Robinson is my that's where I write the most, and I do a little bit of things for Decanter once a year. I do a little bit for Wines and Spirit in America, but Jancis is absolutely my home, and I'm very lucky because there's no editing. I can write about anything I like, and it's a huge thing that you, as a journalist, have that freedom. I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that, and I can express and talk about anything that I really, really like and find compelling. That's something to really treasure. Basically, it started purely by incident. I went to a lunch where she was too. It was a winemaker lunch, or it was a producer from Chianti Classico, a high net worth individual who I thought was playing with wines and making a wine that was not expressive of its origin. Well made, but it didn't do anything. So I asked lots of nasty questions to the cellar master who was there, and that, I think, attracted Jance's attention. And she asked me, "Would you like to write something for my website?" And from that it took off. I then moved partially to Italy because my partner was moving there, and I had already started to do a kind of brokerage with small estates. They were almost all specialized in organics. To come back to your previous question, whether that would interest me more.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, but I was also thinking while we had our little break that I was tasting some Lugana 2 years ago, and that's very difficult to find in any organic way. And it was an old producer.
Doesn't all the Lugana go to Germany anyway?
Yeah. And he was one, cheeky, or the couple was one that made really absolutely genuine, fantastic, crystal clear Lugana, but it was not organic.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a bit of a conflict at the moment as far as because there's been a bit of discussion about it lately in Australia? There's conflict with certification of organic and biodynamic and saying that you use the practices, and people kind of do you think that it is a misrepresentation to say that I use these practices even though you have no certification?
Yeah. Okay. I often see the reverse, in which producers look for the organic certification for its own sake, and using it as a marketing tool. I'm much more adverse against that, or much more adverse when it happens. For a journalist, it's very easy to find out if people are genuine doing the thing they say.
Yeah.
And it's often not even just a vineyard. I can often tell more from looking into the winery than looking into the vineyard. But the vineyard is also a very, very important key. So when people start to talk about it and you ask questions, you should be able to find out in a couple of minutes whether that is genuine. The thing with the certification, at least in Europe, I don't know what it is in Australia, is that there are 40 different certifying bodies having 40 different sets of criteria.
In Europe or in Italy?
In Europe.
In Europe, okay.
And so you can choose as a producer, and I don't mean it in a bad way, you can choose whoever you like or whatever institute you like. And so there's already that. So there's no, a coherent set of one set of criteria to say this is organic. Often people dread the bureaucracy behind it, and some of them don't want to adhere to it because in some years, like 2014, it would have meant that it would have ruined their whole harvest. Now, I am personally believing that there is no way around organics, but that's my personal opinion. I can easily check as a journalist whether people are genuine in organics or use it as a marketing. In organics per se, I am not interested. I see it as a tool to get greater transparency in the wine. If it's used for anything other, like I said, I don't care.
For me, and I apologize, if this does sound a bit crass, but I encounter a lot of wines which do have certification in organics and biodynamics. And I taste the wines and I find them to be just completely uninteresting, and I find them to be a little bit too clean.
Because they're not part of the instrument to create a wine that's genuine.
And for me, that just feeds into this huge divide between viticulture and winemaking. Mm-hmm. And so at one end, particularly in Australia, you have some really exciting winemakers who are using low intervention techniques and are happy to talk about, I did 100% whole bunch, or, we're using, putting it in amphoras and stuff like that. But they potentially don't talk about the viticulture because, they can't say it's organic or they can't say it's biodynamic. Yeah. They might be buying the grapes. And at the other end, you have some, beautifully grown grapes that just there's something that goes wrong with them in the cellars, and then they maybe need to clean them up a little bit, and they just become a little bit empty. And so there's this huge gap between these kinds of wines.
For me, it's fairly easy to figure out what a producer is doing, and I see it also as my task to find out what he or she is up to. That sounds so negative. What is the philosophy behind exactly what these people are doing? Like I said, at a certain price point, you're not talking about producing commodity. You're producing something that expresses origin or originality, and that's what I'm looking for, and that is what they also want to make. The thing is that and that is my personal opinion, often I think they are afraid not to pursue the organic way. And like I said, I'm not interested in the certification process per se, because I see a lot of what you mentioned, a lot of certified wines, and especially places like Whole Foods, and the wines are not good at all. It's just from organically grown grapes. And there is whatever you do in the cellar, there is no control over that.
Because the certification is just in the growing.
Exactly. So I found it a little bit hollow, but can be a good lead. But I see that more as a marketing ploy and to get into shops like Whole Foods. I am that cynical. Yes, I am that cynical. But most of the time when I talk to producers, they're this halfway road. They do the indigenous fermentation. They have the tronconic oak. They have a high plant density, but they don't want to do the organics. And what I find so curious about this is you're already more than halfway down the path where you're looking for more genuine expression of your patch of dirt.
Yeah.
Why stop there? And it's fear. I think it's fear. It comes from either losing fruit, and I can understand that very well, because basically for me, an estate or a producer, it needs to be viable, economically viable. If not, people lose interest in it, and logically so. And the other thing is by the the following of protocols that they have learned in enological schools, which say that you need to do that and then that
Yes.
to have a risk-free wine.
Yes.
And that's an economic decision, which I understand again. But
But in every
often
aspect,
these
it's about risk.
protocols are basically nonsense.
It's about risk taking.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, like the risk of
Well, let's
completely
say you need
removing
to take-
chemicals or irrigation
Yeah,
from
but
your
you need
vineyards.
to take a knowledgeable risk.
Absolutely.
Just risking because then you can have a wine that you can label natural but makes no sense. And you need to be comfortable with it too. I wouldn't push anybody, but I am curious why you would do the indigenous thing and not the rest. You need to progress.
But that's what I find interesting is that, like, I visited producers who converted to organic or biodynamic viticulture, and they talked about, oh, you know, we trialed it in one parcel when we thought the results were so wonderful that we converted everything across.
Yeah.
But then the wines continue to be made the same way.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you know, winemakers who, I'm going to try, you know, I'm going to put some wine on skins, or I'm going to extend the lees contact, or that kind of thing. They experiment with it, they love the results, and so they start to do more and more of that wine. But no one seems to be doing the whole way through. Well, not no
Well,
one,
but
less,
I don't
less
believe
and less.
in revolution. I believe in evolution.
Yeah.
And not everybody can be at the vanguards of change or be in a maverick position for many reasons. And
Money.
who am I? Yeah, but who
Time.
am I to judge?
Yeah.
Who am I to? Because I think that it needs to be an economical, viable business.
Yes.
In every sense, because otherwise it makes no sense. The careful one step at a time approach, I've seen that being applied successfully too. It's just basically to be convinced, okay, I can do it, and then get more and more courage. So I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. Most of the time, not most of the time, but in several cases, I met really very, very left field, radical, natural wine producers who were wearing Gucci shoes. So, which for me translates into there is a financial backup that if that goes tits up, it doesn't matter because, you know, the financial risk is not that big.
Sure.
I'd rather have somebody who then is not more careful and is then convinced by what happens. What I find really fascinating is when they have an agronomist who helps them on the way and they see the change in the vineyard. When I was doing a project in Sicily, I was working with Alessandro Filippi from Soave, and he was a consultant for a Cantina Sociale, a very tiny one near Erice, and we were trying to, you know, we fell immediately in love with all these old Albarello. There were so many of them, and nobody made any money out of it. And we tried to make an organic wine and get that produced by the Cantina Sociale under our name and with screw cap because we wanted to focus on the American and the UK market. But these were like contadini farmers. And one of them had also an apple orchard and olives. And he applied only part of Alessandro's organic philosophy to his vineyard and then told us the year after that he had the best apple harvest ever because the bees had returned. That is interesting.
Yeah.
When the effect is so clear that they then are convinced, and then you don't have to check them, you don't have to safeguard the process anymore, you have convinced them.
Yeah.
That was for me a very
'Cause
exciting moment.
I think that's a perfect example of, you know, the wine doesn't speak for itself. Someone who just works in, you know, is in this cantina or is in, you know, just is a grower. You show them the wine, you go, look, can you see how much better the wine is? And they go, maybe. But when they actually can see where they're working and they see the,
Yeah.
you know, biodiversity being reintroduced back
Yeah.
into the environment,
Yeah.
and that, you know, they go, wow, that's
Yeah,
big
and
difference.
basically you're looking at a system that's basically holistic, right? The one part is connected to the other and blah, blah, blah. But it is very easy to become totally esoteric about it. A lot of the natural wine's output do not convince me, and a lot does. But not because it's natural, just because I find it far more compelling, interesting, textural, more you know, fascinating, more original. But with skin fermented white wines, for example, a lot of them for me taste exactly the same. So
Yes.
I wonder.
They're as
okay,
much technique as
it's
barrique.
fantastic. They stay 2 weeks in the fridge and they don't change. But I don't see the transparency in this. So, you know, but it's a long way, but we're on the way.
So, for regular listeners of my podcast or viewers of
Yeah.
my YouTube channel, they would know that I have a great love of Italian grape varieties being grown in Australia, and this is something that you have been talking a lot about recently, particularly this weekend at the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. Can you tell me a little bit about why you're so excited about Italian grape varieties in Australia?
Goes back for a long while when I was working in Berlin, and we in that restaurant, and we also had winemakers coming over who just wanted to see their wine in on the shelves where we were, because Berlin was so funky and new, and everybody wanted to go there. And one of them told me that the French varieties are so much better because you can make great wines out of them anywhere on the planet.
Yes.
And when I arrived in London, the first Italian grape variety from Australia that I saw was Barbera from Crittenden. And
Wow.
I bought it,
Okay.
I think via Albins, because that was the most exciting and new wine shop that was around, and it was truly like that. And I wrote him a letter. He did that at the time. You wrote letters. You didn't have email, or you did have email, but I used letter. So, and I said, well, very nice wine, but it doesn't taste like Barbera at all. And to which Gary actually sent a reply saying, well, but it cannot be the same like Barbera d'Alba because it's not from Barbera d'Alba. And then I forgot about it. Then I was tasting wine with Jane Faulkner, who is the chief of the Australian Alternative
Varieties Wine Show.
Exactly. And she said,
one of these days I will actually have
you
her as
have
a
to.
guest.
Oh yeah,
one of these
it's
days,
fascinating.
when she has some time.
It's fascinating to talk to her. And so she said, do you judge? I said, yeah, I've been judging for the Canton World Wine Awards and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, come over. And she said, because there's a lot of Italian grape varieties. And I thought, and I remembered this Italian winemaker saying it doesn't travel. And I was thinking of the Crittenden Barbera. So I said, yeah, I'm coming. And when I tasted those wines, I was pretty impressed by the original expressions of these Italian varieties. And for me, it's the Australian miracle. Because without having visited, most producers just had no qualms in admitting that they were had never been to Italy to actually see what the originals were like. Just had a go at it and made wonderful wines. That was very impressive. From that moment on, I thought, well, it has found a second home.
It's very exciting for me.
Yeah.
Of course, I love Italian wines, but I have the love of Italian varieties as well, and so, I'm so enthusiastic to try more wines, and I think that people like Chalmers, who have been on the podcast, and there's a wonderful vineyard in the Adelaide Hills, and there's a fantastic vineyard up in the Riverina, and these what's exciting for me is that there are people who are just buying small parcels of fruit and they're just trying different things and they're changing the language.
It seems that there's no barriers when it comes to Italian or Mediterranean varieties to have to experiment the hell out of it. Times have changed, of course, but the French varieties just doesn't perhaps. They're too referred and too well established to do really crazy things with them to see how far you can push limits. With the Italian varieties, there is no such barrier. You can do whatever you like with them and do as many experiments as you like, and the outcome is often extremely good. And it helps. I think it inspires and it gives a new dynamic, and it helps the thing it helps to bring things on the map that previously were overlooked. So it's a win-win situation for everyone.
Absolutely. Walter, I just wanted to say it's been fantastic chatting with you and sitting in on some of your tastings this weekend.
Thank you.
I really do appreciate your time. Is there anything that you've got coming up apart from more writing on Jancis Robinson? Have you got any projects that you'd like to share with the listeners?
A project that I'm really hesitant about, I would love to do is I am looking at the vineyards in Alto Piemonte. It's going to be probably Bramatero or Lessona. What I wanted to do was there's basically a possibility of a cooperation between Mac Forbes, me, Cristiano Garella, and Giovanni Angeli from Masolino, from Serralunga. Exactly. and that we would produce a wine of Nebbiolo or Spanna from that area. I was a little bit naive. I went in there and thought, okay, if we find a nice vineyard and growers sell the fruit, then we would start off with this cuvee. But it seems to need more commitment, and that might mean purchasing a vineyard, and that should be well thought, because in the end, like I said, it needs to be economic viable,
Sure.
an economic viable thing. But it excites me. That's something that might be extracurricular to my writing for Gensis, which I will continue.
Fantastic. And the website is jensisrobinson.com.
Yes.
If people would like to follow you on social media,
Then it would be Walter Speller. That's for Twitter.
on Twitter.
And the same for Facebook.
On Facebook
But
as well.
basically, I'm very lazy on Facebook. I just feed into Twitter.
Yeah, that's pretty easy.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Once again, my sincerest thanks to Walter Speller for generously donating some of his valuable time whilst he was here in Australia. And it was certainly a wonderful experience. I learnt a lot just talking with him. And of course, thank you for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And as I mentioned it on every episode, you can follow me on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, I'm at Intrepid Wino, and the podcast can be found on Twitter under at the Vincast. If you go to facebook.com/Intrepid Wino, you'll find my Facebook page, so please do hit that like button. You can come and visit my YouTube channel if you look for Intrepid Wino channel. That's where I do my Let's Taste videos, where I open up Australian wines and share my impressions. Make sure you subscribe to that. Of course, you can subscribe to the podcast on various different podcast hosting platforms, including iTunes. And subscribing to the podcast means that you get the episode as soon as it becomes available every week. You can also share your impressions of the podcast, which I would really love for you to do, by leaving a 5-star rating and a bit of a review, just to let me know which episodes you enjoyed or which guests you might want to hear from. All that information is available at intrepidwino.com, including ways of getting in contact with myself. And please do. I'd love to get some feedback about the podcast or about anything that I do as the Intrepid Wino. I look forward to having you on the next episode. But until then, bye.